Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Time and place matter, especially in discussions like this, because some symbols, once spoken of, begin to behave as if they were listening. Tonight, we turn our attention to a symbol that defies definition, resists consensus, and continues to mutate across fiction, ritual, and philosophy. The Elder Sign. Originally a creation of H.P. Lovecraft's mythos, the Elder Sign has persisted not merely as a protective glyph, but as a cipher. Its form, its function, even its origin remain deeply contested. Unlike the more widely recognized names, Cthulhu, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, the Elder Sign is not a character. It is not a monster. It is a rupture in meaning itself. And for precisely that reason, it continues to draw the attention of scholars, gamers, occultists, and readers who find themselves asking questions they cannot easily answer. We will trace its appearance through literary history, from Lovecraft's vague mentions to Derleth's rigid redesigns, through its role in narrative myth-making, magical systems, and even pseudo-real-world sightings. But this is not simply a study in fiction. It is an inquiry into how symbols work, how they protect, how they deceive, and how they replicate in the spaces between certainty and speculation. By the end, you may not know what the Elder Sign is, but you may begin to understand why not knowing is the point. Let us proceed. The Elder Sign, though often overshadowed by the monstrous pantheon of Lovecraft's mythos, occupies a unique and foundational role in the architecture of cosmic horror. It is not a creature, nor a place, nor even a comprehensible object. It is a symbol, and as such, it operates at the threshold between the seen and the concealed, between narrative device and metaphysical rupture. To understand its origins, we must first situate it within the evolving body of Lovecraft's work during the 1920s and 1930s, a period when his interest in blasphemous texts, unknowable languages, and liminal spaces began to coalesce into a pseudo-mythological system. The Elder Sign does not appear in his earliest stories, but rather emerges later as a cryptic form of defense, a mark that protects not by force, but by resonance with some ancient unspoken law. It is in The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1936, and The Shadow Out of Time, 1936, that we find indirect references to protective glyphs and alien epistemologies, but the term Elder Sign itself is more clearly aligned with the dream quest of unknown Kadath. Written 1926-27, published posthumously in 1943, where it is alluded to without explication. Lovecraft's tendency to withhold descriptive clarity, whether in reference to the sign's shape, its origin, or its precise effect, is not a narrative failure, but a deliberate act of anti-definition. He was crafting not a taxonomy, but an aura, letters to correspondents such as Clark. Ashton Smith and August Derleth suggest that Lovecraft viewed the Elder Sign not as a talismanic object in the traditional sense, but as a thematic necessity, a conceptual counterweight to the overwhelming nihilism of the outer gods. In a 1930 letter, Lovecraft remarked, "The Elder Sign is not to be taken as a pentacle or ward in any known occult fashion. It is rather an alignment, a thing in tune with the order of the multiverse." We must pause here. This rejection of traditional magical semiotics is significant. Lovecraft, though steeped in the language of forbidden tomes and eldritch incantations, was fundamentally skeptical of the occult revivalism that defined much of the 19th and early 20th century. The Theosophical Society, the Golden Dawn, and the proliferation of faux Egyptian symbology in American spiritualist circles all aimed to reveal hidden truth. Lovecraft's Elder Sign, by contrast, does not reveal. It conceals, or more precisely, it preserves the limits of the knowable. It is not a gateway, but a gatekeeper. In this sense, it is less akin to a cross or pentagram than to the black obelisk in Arthur C. Clarke's 2001, A Space Odyssey, a monolith whose meaning resides in its refusal to speak. August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor and the co-founder of Arkham House, introduced a dramatic shift in the Elder Sign's depiction in the 1940s. In his efforts to systematize and moralize the mythos, Derleth recast the Elder Sign as a literal five-pointed star with a flaming eye at its center, often etched in stone or drawn in chalk to ward off evil entities. This was not merely an artistic embellishment. It was a transformation of Lovecraft's ontological ambiguity into a functional, quasi-Christian defense mechanism. Derleth, influenced by Roman Catholicism and a Manichaean worldview, sought to impose an order of good versus evil upon a cosmos that Lovecraft had intentionally rendered as amoral, entropic, and alien. The Elder Sign, under Derleth's pen, became a symbol of cosmic righteousness, an apotropaic weapon rather than a symbol of metaphysical otherness. Consider carefully the implications of this divergence. Where Lovecraft's sign operated as an inscrutable boundary, perhaps even a joke at the expense of human attempts to systematize the unknown, Derleth's version reinstated anthropocentric confidence. The sign now worked, had power, had rules. It could be learned, taught, and deployed. In short, it became magical rather than symbolic. This split remains one of the most enduring points of contention among scholars and fans of the mythos. Is the Elder Sign a literal device with metaphysical efficacy? Or is it a narrative placeholder, a trace of the inexpressible? It is not simply a symbol of protection, it is a symbol of symbolism itself, a metafictional artifact that questions the relationship between language, meaning, and belief. The wider historical context in which Lovecraft wrote further complicates the issue. The 1920s and 30s were decades of radical epistemological instability. Einstein's theories of relativity, Freud's model of the unconscious, and the disintegration of classical causality through quantum mechanics all contributed to an intellectual atmosphere in which knowledge was no longer stable. Lovecraft, though not a scientist, was an avid reader of scientific popularizations. His fiction frequently reflects the anxiety of a universe stripped of divine order. In this context, the Elder Sign becomes not a religious relic, but an epistemic symptom, a glyph that means precisely because it refuses to mean in the way symbols are expected to. One might draw a comparison here to the concept of the floating signifier in post-structuralist theory. As Roland Barthes and Jacques Derrida later articulated, some signs gain power not through fixed definition, but through their very instability. The Elder Sign functions similarly. It accrues weight by being contested. Its contradictory representations, a tree branch fractal in some versions, a flaming star in others, do not cancel each other out. They deepen the mystery. It is not one thing, it is many. It is not clarity, it is density. This reveals something profound. The Elder Sign is Lovecraft's admission that even within his own mythos, there must be fractures. Places where language fails, where protection is promised but never explained. It is not a key to understanding the mythos. It is the mark that understanding will never be total. In this sense, the sign is not marginal, but central to Lovecraft's project. It holds the mythos together by reminding us that some parts must always remain sealed. As we move into the next subsection on cultural and philosophical antecedents, we must ask, where does such a symbol come from? What historical and mythic forces preceded the Elder Sign's appearance, and how might they have shaped its form, not as image but as concept? The question is not simply one of influence, it is a question of inheritance. Let us now trace the ancestral lineage of the symbol that never settles. The Elder Sign, as it emerges from the pages of Lovecraft's work and the interpretive chaos that followed, did not originate in a vacuum. It stands upon the shoulders of millennia of cultural symbol-making, echoing the long human history of using signs, glyphs, and sigils to mark boundaries between the sacred and the profane, the safe and the profane, the known and the unknowable. Though it is frequently described in purely fictional terms, its conceptual DNA is interwoven with traditions ranging from medieval apotropaic magic to Gnostic cosmology. To understand the Elder Sign's resonance, we must examine its philosophical and cultural antecedents, not simply for comparison, but to uncover the collective psychological need for such a symbol in the first place. Throughout history, symbols have served not only as conveyors of meaning, but as instruments of protection. In ancient Mesopotamia, the use of clay tablets inscribed with protective incantations was widespread. In Egypt, the Eye of Horus operated both as talisman and as a signifier of restored cosmic order. The Jewish mezuzah, affixed to the doorposts of homes, serves not only a ritual function, but marks a symbolic threshold between the inside and the outside, the protected and the exposed. The pentagram, associated with Pythagorean harmony and later Christian symbolism, similarly occupies a space between sacred geometry and magical ward. These signs function not merely to inform, but to shield, to push back against an external force that threatens the integrity of the individual or community. In this respect, the elder sign aligns with an ancient human impulse, to place a mark in the face of the unknown. However, we must recognize that Lovecraft's treatment of the elder sign subverts this tradition even as it invokes it. It is not simply a continuation of talismanic symbolism. It is a philosophical inversion. In most traditions, the protective symbol derives its power from divine alignment or ritual coherence, from participation in a shared cosmology. The elder sign, by contrast, exists in a universe without divine coherence, where the forces it guards against are not evil, but indifferent. The power of the elder sign, if it exists at all, does not arise from spiritual alignment, but from resonance with an alien order beyond comprehension. It is not a symbol that reassures. It is a symbol that isolates, placing its bearer outside the normal frame of reference. This suggests that the elder sign may be closer in spirit to the taboo markings of apotropaic boundaries, those used to mark out plague houses, cursed tombs, or forbidden knowledge, than to any benevolent sacred icon. A more nuanced antecedent can be found in the concept of the sigil, especially as developed in the magical traditions of the Renaissance, and later appropriated by the 20th century occult revival. Sigils, such as those found in the grimoires Key of Solomon or the Lesser Key of Solomon, Lemegeton, are not depictions but constructions, coded diagrams that represent non-human intelligences or metaphysical principles. Often incomprehensible at first glance, they demand interpretation and sometimes personal reinvention. In modern chaos magic, pioneered by Austin Osman Spare and further popularized by Peter J. Carroll in the 1970s, sigils are created from phrases or desires, abstracted until they become unrecognizable, and then used as focal points of ritual. They are personalized enigmas, activated by belief and intention rather than divine sanction. The elder sign, ambiguous and shape-shifting across texts and adaptations, behaves similarly. Not a shared symbol with fixed meaning, but a mnemonic for that which defies meaning. Consider carefully how Lovecraft's fiction toys with the act of signification itself. In The Dunwich Horror, incantations and symbols are used to restrain the invisible entity Yog-Sothoth, but the reader is never given a full linguistic or visual account of how these tools operate. Similarly, in The Dreams in the Witch House, mathematical diagrams and alien geometries function both as barriers and as gateways. The symbol is never just a symbol. It is a trap, a mirror, a key. The elder sign, then, may be best understood not as a fixed glyph, but as a philosophical proposition. That protection is only possible through alignment with something older, stranger, and perhaps more hostile than the human mind can accommodate. It is not protection from cosmic horror. It is protection by way of cosmic horror. One may draw comparison to Gnostic cosmology, where arcane symbols and secret knowledge, gnosis, were required to pass through the hostile archons that govern the layers of reality. These esoteric marks were not guarantees of safety. They were passwords to ambiguity, symbols that pointed toward liberation through alienation. In Lovecraft's mythos, there is no demiurge to escape and no pleroma to return to, but the structure of secret symbols, forgotten names, and cosmic guardians remains. The elder sign, then, becomes a kind of negative gnosis, a sign that you do not belong, and therefore are temporarily immune to forces that assume all minds belong to them. We must also consider the psychological need for such a symbol in the modern age. The early 20th century, when Lovecraft was most prolific, was a period marked by disillusionment with Enlightenment rationalism, shattered by the First World War, and unsettled by new scientific theories that made the universe feel increasingly unstable. The elder sign emerges as a response to this shifting epistemological landscape, not a token of divine order, but a desperate scrawl made in defiance of it. It is not a claim of knowledge, but a mark of survivor's awareness, a recognition that some forces cannot be met head-on, but may just barely be warded off by a symbol that has no meaning except the gesture of its making. This reveals something unsettling. The elder sign is both inherited and invented. It stands at the crossroads of magical history, philosophical doubt, and narrative strategy. It is not a relic from a forgotten past, nor a novelty of fiction. It is the modern sigil of modern anxiety, born from tradition, but hollowed out by cosmic nihilism. In its ambiguity, it gains power. In its mutability, it survives. As we turn now to the question of language itself, the etymology of the phrase elder sign, and the symbolic grammar it inhabits, we move even deeper into the territory of paradox. What does it mean to name the unnamed? To cast a sign in a universe where signs are swallowed by entropy? We proceed next to the symbolic language of the elder sign, and how every attempt to define it may itself be part of its defense. The phrase elder sign is deceptively simple, yet within those two words lies a semantic labyrinth, a structure of meaning that continually folds back upon itself. To call it elder is to assert age, hierarchy, and precedence, but also to imply that it predates human culture and cognition. To call it a sign is to invoke the domain of language and semiotics, yet Lovecraft's symbol consistently evades both legibility and definition. In other words, the elder sign occupies a peculiar linguistic position. It is both word and unword, communication and concealment. This duality, far from accidental, reveals Lovecraft's deliberate engagement with language not as a vehicle for revelation, but as an instrument of limitation, a way of marking the edges of thought itself. When the elder sign first appears in Lovecraft's correspondence, particularly in letters to Clark Ashton Smith and R.H. Barlow in the early 1930s, he describes it only as a device used to protect against certain beings, offering no visual or descriptive cues. Scholars such as S.T. Joshi and Donald Burleson have noted that Lovecraft's refusal to define the sign linguistically mirrors his larger narrative technique. He creates significance through absence. According to Burleson, the sign signifies the impossibility of signification. It gestures toward a language that cannot exist within human syntax, a symbolic residue from an earlier order of communication, perhaps pre-verbal, perhaps non-human. This is not mysticism. It is semiotic horror, the recognition that symbols can fail, that language itself can betray the human mind. We must pause here to consider how Lovecraft's use of the term elder complicates the matter further. In most mythologies, elder implies wisdom or divinity, elder gods, elder races, elder laws. But in Lovecraft's lexicon, age is not equated with benevolence or enlightenment. It is equated with indifference. The elder things of At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, are scientifically brilliant, architecturally sublime, yet utterly alien to morality. Thus, when Lovecraft describes a sign associated with the elders, he inverts the traditional hierarchy of sacred protection. The elder sign may indeed shield humanity, but its power originates from alignment with something older and less human than humanity itself. It is not a prayer. It is a foreign password, uttered without understanding. In semiotic terms, this paradox is profound. Ferdinand de Saussure's model of the sign divides meaning into two components: the signifier, form, and the signified, concept. Lovecraft's elder sign collapses this relationship. The symbol refuses to stabilize meaning, functioning instead as what Jacques Derrida would later call difference, a perpetual deferral of definition. Even within Lovecraft's own circle, its description fluctuates wildly. In some accounts, it resembles a branching twig or a comet-like glyph. In Derleth's later codification, it becomes a star with a flaming eye. Each version claims Uos, authority, yet none achieves consensus. The elder sign's multiplicity is not a weakness of canon, it is its defensive mechanism. A symbol that cannot be pinned down cannot be invalidated. Historically, Lovecraft's sensitivity to linguistic instability reflects the intellectual currents of his time. The early 20th century saw the rise of modernist experimentation, psychoanalytic theory, and the fracturing of linguistic certainty through philosophers such as Ludwig Wittgenstein. In Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, 1921, Wittgenstein proposed that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. Lovecraft seems to echo this sentiment in fictional form. The elder sign demarcates precisely that boundary between what can be expressed and what must remain unspoken. To encounter it is to face the limits of cognition made visible, to stand at the linguistic shoreline where words begin to dissolve into symbol and symbol into silence. This interplay between symbol and speech has often led commentators to interpret the elder sign as a linguistic fossil, a remnant of a primordial language, akin to the Aklo tongue referenced in Lovecraft's collaborations with Arthur Machen's mythos. The Aklo words said to open hidden gates represent knowledge that predates human articulation. In this light, the elder sign may function not as a pictorial glyph, but as a phonetic relic, a syllable or vibration that still resonates within the fabric of the cosmos. It is not an image but a frequency, a semiotic residue of an earlier alignment. The sign's ineffability is not narrative mystery, it is ontological design. We must recognize, however, that the phrase sign also carries a theological undertone. In Christian scripture, a sign is a manifestation of divine will, the burning bush, the star of Bethlehem, the stigmata. Lovecraft, a self-professed materialist and atheist, reconfigures this sacred vocabulary into an anti-theology. His elder sign offers no covenant, no salvation, only survival. It does not affirm meaning, it marks its absence. This reversal is crucial. In Lovecraft's cosmos, the only signs that exist are those that remind us of the futility of interpretation. The elder sign is the emblem of unknowing elevated to art. Consider carefully the linguistic tension embedded in the mythos as a whole. Words like Necronomicon, Yog-Sothoth, and Kadath have no etymological roots. They are designed to sound plausible, yet alien. Their power lies in their phonetic proximity to meaning, always almost interpretable, yet never fully assimilable. The elder sign extends this principle into visual and symbolic form. Whether drawn, carved, or imagined, it occupies the same semiotic gray zone. It is not quite language, not quite art, not quite magic. It stands where these categories blur, a sigil of linguistic entropy. This reveals something profound. The elder sign's ambiguity is not a problem to be solved, but the essence of its function. In Lovecraft's universe, clarity is dangerous. To define something absolutely is to invite it into the mind, where it may take root and spread. The elder sign therefore protects by remaining indeterminate. It cannot be commodified, canonized, or fully visualized without losing its power. Like a word that erases itself as it is spoken, it endures precisely because it refuses resolution. As we move next into myth-building and narrative authenticity, we will see how this instability, linguistic, symbolic, and interpretive, became central to the mythos's realism. The elder sign, by refusing to settle into any single form, became more than a fictional construct. It became a living artifact of uncertainty, bridging story and belief, language and silence, protection and paradox. Among the many elements that anchor Lovecraft's mythos in an unsettling realism, few are as quietly effective as the elder sign. It does not command the reader's attention with spectacle. It does not function as a central plot device. Instead, it lingers at the periphery, a marginal symbol, invoked sparingly, yet always with the implication that it carries great weight. In this way, the elder sign operates as a textual artifact of narrative authenticity. It gestures toward a larger world beyond the page, a mythic system that appears internally consistent, yet remains fundamentally incomplete. This paradox, the suggestion of system within deliberate ambiguity, is the hallmark of effective myth-building, and the elder sign plays a critical role in maintaining that illusion. H.P. Lovecraft did not construct his mythos as a closed cosmology. Unlike Tolkien, whose legendarium strives for philological completeness, Lovecraft allowed contradictions, gaps, and uncertainties to persist. The elder sign exemplifies this open-ended approach. It is referenced in multiple stories: The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1926 by 27, The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, and The Haunter of the Dark, 1935, yet never fully defined. This recurring presence, always half-explained, gives the impression of a deeply embedded symbol passed down through hidden traditions. Lovecraft's decision to refrain from specifying its form or function was not, as some have claimed, a failure of world-building. Rather, it was a calculated method of narrative estrangement. By resisting definition, the sign generates a feeling of historicity, of a symbol that predates the narrative itself, We must recognize the strategy at work here. The elder sign functions as what literary theorist Umberto Eco called a floating signifier, a term or image that defers meaning rather than delivering it, thereby inviting interpretation without exhausting it. This floating quality allows the sign to inhabit a mythological gray zone, appearing at once ancient and newly discovered, sacred and suspect, known and unknowable. It is not merely a plot device, but a world-building device. When a character refers to the elder sign with fear or reverence, the reader infers a backstory, a tradition, perhaps even a doctrine that has never been written. This technique is remarkably effective in creating what Tolkien referred to as secondary belief, the immersive realism that allows fictional worlds to feel inhabited, layered, and enduring. Moreover, Lovecraft's invocation of the elder sign often occurs within documentary formats, journals, letters, grimoires, and unreliable testimonies. These narrative frames simulate the texture of archival discovery, and the inclusion of a recurring but underexplained symbol contributes to this illusion. In The Dunwich Horror, 1928, for example, the Necronomicon is quoted as if it were a real book, and the elder sign is referenced obliquely in association with protective rights. By embedding the symbol within quasi-scholarly contexts, Lovecraft aligns it with the mechanics of folklore. It becomes, in effect, a narrative artifact, a detail that reinforces the fiction's internal realism by behaving like a trace of an older story. Consider carefully how this technique mirrors the construction of real-world mythology. In many religious and esoteric traditions, there exist symbols whose meanings are never fully disclosed, glyphs on tombs, sigils in grimoires, architectural motifs whose origins are forgotten. These symbols gain power not from clarity, but from obscurity. The more they evade explanation, the more they invite speculation. The elder sign inherits this logic. It behaves not like a symbol created by a single author, but like a fragment from a long-lost system of knowledge. It is not simply fictional, it is folkloric within fiction. This strategy is further reinforced by the intertextuality of the mythos. Lovecraft encouraged other writers, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, Frank Belknap Long, and later August Derleth, to incorporate elements of his mythos into their own stories. As these authors picked up the elder sign and began to describe it in divergent ways, the symbol's authenticity paradoxically increased. Disagreement, after all, is a feature of real belief systems. Scholars rarely agree on the exact shape of an ancient sigil or the proper pronunciation of a sacred word. The multiplicity of the elder sign's representations, Derleth's five-pointed star with flaming eye, Chaosium's rune-like glyph, and Lovecraft's original vagueness, only deepens its aura of antiquity. It is not a sign that can be canonized. It is a sign that functions through polysemy. We must pause to observe the cultural feedback loop this creates. As fans and scholars debate the correct version of the elder sign, they inadvertently enact the same dynamics present in the fiction. Forums become grimoire commentaries. Fan art becomes apocrypha. Role-playing games become rituals of reenactment. The symbol's meaning is performed into being through endless repetition, reinterpretation, and resistance to closure. In this way, the elder sign extends beyond the page and into culture, functioning as what scholar Jeffrey J. Kripal might call a revelatory symbol, one that transforms the reader through the act of contemplation, even when, especially when, its meaning remains elusive. This reveals something profound. The elder sign is not a fixed artifact within the mythos. It is the engine of myth-making itself. It invites a kind of reverent speculation that mirrors religious inquiry, folkloric transmission, and even conspiracy theory logic. The more it resists definition, the more real it seems. The less it says, the more it implies. This is not failure, it is a function. The elder sign marks the place where fiction simulates tradition, and where tradition begins to function as a form of narrative defense. It is not merely a symbol within the mythos, it is a symbol of the mythos. As we move into part 2, where we will explore the nature and themes associated with the elder sign, we must carry forward this recognition. That meaning in Lovecraft's work is always unstable, always haunted by absences and silences. The elder sign, more than any monster or grimoire, teaches us that in the mythos, the most important truths are those left unexplained. Let us now consider the conceptual terrain this symbol inhabits, not as image or story, but as philosophical principle. To fully grasp the philosophical force of the elder sign, one must first understand the conceptual terrain it is meant to inhabit and resist. The symbol, whether imagined as a jagged glyph, a stellar diagram, or a fragment of forgotten language, exists not in opposition to evil, but in confrontation with cosmic indifference. The elder sign is not a guardian against malevolence in any traditional moral sense. It is a mark that stands between the human psyche and a universe governed by entropy, abstraction, and epistemic decay. It functions as a symbolic pause, a momentary act of resistance in a cosmos that neither sees nor cares. Lovecraft's fiction, especially between 1926 and 1935, is suffused with what scholars have called ontological horror, not merely fear of the unknown, but the deeper fear that there is no structure beneath the surface, only chaotic vastness. Stories like The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, and The Shadow Out of Time, 1936, all suggest a recurring philosophical motif, that human beings occupy no special position in the universe, and that all our systems of meaning, science, religion, myth, are temporary illusions. The elder sign, in this regard, functions not as a symbol of reassurance, but as a symbol of interruption. It delays the inevitable realization that all systems decay, that all minds unravel, and that all truths collapse under the weight of cosmic scale. Consider carefully how the elder sign is deployed narratively. It is never a permanent solution, never a source of illumination. It is a stopgap, a symbol that temporarily holds back madness, corruption, or contact with something more alien than we can define. In The Haunter of the Dark, 1935, the protagonist's last hope is a small stone bearing the elder sign, left behind in a church steeple as a deterrent to Nyarlathotep's avatar. Yet even this act of warding fails once light is extinguished. The lesson is not that the sign is ineffective, but that nothing can ultimately stop entropy. The symbol delays the breach, but never seals it. This reveals something crucial. The elder sign is not a talisman of triumph, but a glyph of deferral, a gesture toward protection in a universe where protection is temporary at best. This tension is reinforced by Lovecraft's fascination with entropy, not only thermodynamically, but symbolically. In The Shadow Out of Time, humanity is shown to be one of many transient species, rising and falling across geologic time. The great race of Yeth records knowledge only to transfer itself to new hosts as their civilizations fall into ruin. Entropy here is not just physical decay, it is the collapse of meaning across time. The elder sign, then, may be understood as a symbolic reaction to this collapse. It does not preserve truth, it acknowledges the futility of preservation while still choosing to resist. It is not a seal of order, but a mark that says, not yet. We must pause here and address the philosophical backdrop of insignificance, which underpins all mythos fiction. Lovecraft's protagonists frequently come into contact with forces so vast that their mental architectures disintegrate. Their minds are not defeated by horror, but by scale. The elder sign's significance lies not in offering comprehension, but in serving as a symbolic firewall, an effort to remain intact in the face of what cannot be measured. It is not victory, it is survival without understanding. This is what distinguishes the sign from more traditional sacred symbols, which offer meaning as protection. The elder sign offers no meaning, it offers distance. There is also the matter of dream reality, a concept that Lovecraft explored most vividly in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadoth and other dream cycle stories. In these tales, the boundary between waking and dreaming becomes porous, and the laws of metaphysics begin to behave strangely. The elder sign is referenced here not as a magical tool, but as a principle, a stabilizing force within a dream logic framework. If reality itself is revealed to be a dream, then symbols such as the elder sign function as dream anchors, keeping the dreamer tethered to some axis of resistance. This situates the elder sign within a long philosophical lineage. From Plato's cave to Descartes' demon, thinkers have long worried that perception may be illusory. Lovecraft updates this anxiety through cosmic scale. If we are dreaming, he suggests, it is not because the gods wish to deceive us, but because no god ever watched to begin with. not X, but Y. The elder sign is not a sacred seal, not a tool of divine righteousness. It is a linguistic scar left by the human mind as it recoils from what it cannot absorb. It is not an emblem of salvation. It is an artifact of refusal, and in this, it reflects a deeply modern despair, that the universe is not malevolent, but structurally inaccessible. The sign, then, becomes a human construction, a symbol for holding on, even when meaning is gone. We must recognize that the elder sign is not a beacon of hope. It is a symbol for those who have seen too much and lived. It is a metaphysical brace, not a ladder. As we transition to the next subsection on the entities or forces involved, we will examine how the sign operates in relation to those cosmic intelligences it supposedly wards off. The deeper question, of course, is whether such beings can even be warded against, or whether, like entropy and time, they are forces that symbols only delay, but never defeat. The elder sign's philosophical gravity intensifies when we examine the entities it supposedly wards against, or, perhaps more accurately, momentarily distracts. To invoke the sign at all is to acknowledge a hierarchy of beings whose existence obliterates human categories. These are not gods in any theological sense, nor demons in the moral one. They are ontological intrusions, forces whose mere recognition destabilizes perception, reason, and identity. The elder sign, therefore, operates as a boundary marker, not between good and evil, but between the humanly conceivable and the cosmically operative. In the taxonomy of Lovecraft's mythos, these entities fall roughly into two overlapping spheres: the great old ones, bound to the material universe, and the outer gods, who dwell in dimensions of chaos beyond comprehension. Cthulhu, Dagon, and Hastur belong to the first sphere, vast intelligences entombed in matter, dreaming in cycles of planetary time. Azathoth and Yog-Sothoth belong to the second, a blind idiot creator and a cosmic gatekeeper, respectively, who embody the principles of uncreation and boundless simultaneity. Against such beings, the elder sign offers neither equality nor combat. It offers insulation. It is not a weapon, it is a margin of difference. To draw the sign is to carve a conceptual space in which the mind may continue to believe itself separate. We must recognize the irony. The elder sign's supposed power lies not in its ability to affect these entities, but in its ability to maintain belief in distinction. When a human inscribes the sign, they are not resisting the old ones. They are preserving a psychological fiction that resistance is possible. Lovecraft's letters often reinforce this notion. In one missive to Clark Ashton Smith, 1930, he describes the elder sign as a token of older forces not benign, but antithetical to the intrusion of chaos. The word antithetical here is key. It does not imply goodness, only structural opposition. The elder sign functions like an immune response within the cosmic body, a localized stasis in an otherwise dissolving universe. Consider The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, where symbols resembling the elder sign appear in esoteric jewelry and crumbling architecture. The people of Innsmouth, descendants of an ancient pact with the sea god Dagon, wear these designs not as charms of protection, but as emblems of devotion. The same geometry serves opposite purposes depending on alignment. This ambiguity is essential. The elder sign cannot be monopolized by one moral or metaphysical side. It does not discriminate between worship and resistance. It merely delineates difference. One can be protected by it or enslaved by it, depending on which side of the boundary one stands. The idea that the sign protects from some entities while inviting others recalls the paradoxes of real-world esoteric systems. In grimoires such as the Clavicula Salomonis or Picatrix, symbols of command also serve as gateways, control and exposure coexisting within the same mark. The elder sign follows this logic to its cosmic conclusion. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1927, Randolph Carter uses ancient sigils to navigate the Dreamlands, encountering both the benign Elder Ones and the hostile Nyarlathotep. Here, the sign seems to represent a frequency of recognition, an attunement that determines whether one is destroyed or spared. It is not the symbol that protects, but the harmonic of comprehension. The wrong resonance invites annihilation, the right one delays it. Not X, but Y. The Elder sign is not an instrument of power, but a gesture of non-participation. It is not drawn to summon, but to refuse connection. In a cosmos governed by beings whose awareness unravels human minds, refusal itself becomes an act of defiance. This makes the elder sign the closest thing Lovecraft's atheistic universe allows to prayer, not to a god, but to structure itself. To inscribe the sign is to affirm the continued coherence of form in a world tending toward formlessness. Philosophically, this dynamic resonates with the concept of the limit experience in existential thought. Georges Bataille, and later Michel Foucault, described moments when the self brushes against the edges of the inexpressible, sexual ecstasy, violence, madness. Lovecraft's characters encounter these limits through contact with non-human entities. The elder sign operates as the psychic equivalent of a safety harness at the cliff edge of meaning. It does not pull the subject back from the abyss. It keeps them suspended just long enough to witness it. The sign's function, therefore, is not salvation, but suspension. We must pause to reflect on Yog-Sothoth, perhaps the most metaphysically intricate of Lovecraft's beings. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key, Lovecraft writes in the Dunwich Horror. This paradox encapsulates the terror of cosmic totality, a being that embodies both threshold and traversal, containment and release. The elder sign, in this context, becomes the inverse of Yog-Sothoth, a boundary without gate, a lock without key. It does not open, it holds. Yet even holding has a cost. In resisting the infinite, the sign also mirrors it. To inscribe a form against chaos is to admit chaos's reality, to acknowledge its defining absence. The elder sign thus participates in the very forces it resists. This reveals something profound. The elder sign, though invoked as protection, is itself a symptom of exposure. It marks those who know too much, scholars, dreamers, cultists, as irrevocably touched by the inhuman. Like the scar left by a burn, it signifies both injury and survival. It is not a charm to keep darkness away, but evidence that one has already looked into it. Every mention of the sign in the mythos, from the Haunter of the Dark to Derleth's codifications, carries this doubleness. It protects, yes, but at the price of acknowledging what must not be known. As we move next into subsection 2.3, we will explore how human beings interact with the elder sign, not merely as symbol, but as experience. If 2.2 has traced the sign's relation to cosmic entities, 2.3 will trace its effect upon the human mind, the paradoxical blend of safety and madness, comprehension and collapse. The boundary, once drawn, does not only keep the monsters out, it keeps the one who drew it forever within its circle. The elder sign occupies a curious intersection between symbol and experience. It is not merely a glyph drawn upon stone or flesh, it is a psychological mechanism, a metaphysical tether, and perhaps most disturbingly, a filter through which human consciousness momentarily survives contact with the unnameable. The notion that one might interact with the sign is deceptively reassuring. In Lovecraft's mythos, to use the elder sign is not to gain mastery, but to admit vulnerability. It is a gesture of containment within a reality that has already begun to fray. The act of invoking the sign does not prevent madness. It only delays it. In The Haunter of the Dark, 1935, the protagonist Robert Blake learns of the elder sign's placement in the steeple of the Starry Wisdom Church. This is no casual precaution. It is described with the gravitas of a religious relic, a final defense against an entity that feeds on awareness itself. Yet the sign fails, or rather, its power is conditional. When the church is plunged into darkness, the being it restrains, and Nyarlathotep's avatar, emerges. The implication is chilling. The sign is not a seal, but a sensorial circuit breaker. As long as certain sensory conditions are met, light, pattern, geometry, the boundary holds. Once these conditions lapse, the human mind becomes permeable once more. We must recognize that this portrayal of madness differs fundamentally from traditional Gothic horror. In Mary Shelley or Edgar Allan Poe, madness often results from guilt, grief, or trauma, emotional or moral, failures within the self. Lovecraftian madness, by contrast, is epistemological. It arises not from what is felt, but from what is known. The elder sign exists precisely at this threshold. It is not a curative for insanity. It is a signpost indicating how close the mind has come to irreparable knowledge. In this way, The sign becomes not a protective ward, but a symbol of cognitive brinksmanship, of how far thought can stretch before breaking. Consider The Dunwich Horror, 1928, where the sign is used by Dr. Armitage and his colleagues to repel the invisible offspring of Yog-Sothoth. Their deployment of the sign is framed as a scientific ritual, part invocation, part geometry, part ancient lore. Yet the story also makes clear that this act of protection requires conceptual fluency. The symbol's power is not inherent. It functions only for those who understand or believe they understand the forces at play. For the uninitiated, the sign is meaningless. For the over-initiated, it may come too late. This suggests a terrifying paradox, that in order to use the elder sign, one must come close enough to madness to feel its breath, close enough that using it may trigger the very collapse it was meant to avert. Not X, but Y. The elder sign is not a shield, but a threshold marker. It does not promise sanity. It promises recognition of the point at which sanity ceases to function. This distinction matters because it reframes the human interaction with the sign as a ritual of containment, not for the monster, but for the self. Lovecraft's characters do not brandish the sign as an emblem of heroism. They whisper it, hide it, trace it with trembling hands. It is used in silence, not proclamation. This quietness reinforces the existential dread embedded in its usage. It is not meant to inspire confidence. It is meant to delay annihilation. Scholars such as Timo Iraksinen and Dirk Veeman have observed that Lovecraft's treatment of the symbol parallels real-world phenomena in trauma psychology and symbolic anthropology. In cultures where madness is interpreted as spiritual possession or cosmic disruption, certain symbols are believed to hold the self together, not by curing the condition, but by naming the space of fracture. The elder sign, in this anthropological frame, becomes a ritualized performance of coherence in the face of dissolution. It is not unlike the use of mandalas in Tibetan Buddhism or the sigils of Renaissance grimoires, structured forms meant to map and limit chaos, even temporarily. There is also a crucial visual and tactile component. In role-playing games such as Call of Cthulhu or digital media like Eternal Darkness, the elder sign must be drawn, traced, or activated through physical interaction. This requirement mirrors ancient magical practices in which the drawing of protective circles or pentagrams created a bounded space, psychological, symbolic, metaphysical. But unlike the optimistic arcana of medieval magic, the elder sign does not promise contact with higher powers. It does not invoke spirits who serve. It wards against awareness. It is not the beginning of a ritual, but the last defense against one already underway. We must pause to ask, is the elder sign truly effective? Or is it simply the last human gesture, a vestigial reflex of meaning in a universe that no longer recognizes such distinctions? The sign's repeated failures, or partial successes, in Lovecraft's stories suggest that it may be less a tool and more a metaphysical plea. Its very invocation marks the subject as changed, altered by proximity to the unknown. Madness, then, is not a punishment for trespass. It is the natural response to having glimpsed too much. This reveals something profound. The elder sign does not prevent contact. It signals that contact has already occurred. It is a scar, not a cure. A reminder that the mind, once opened, cannot fully close again. In this light, all human interaction with the sign becomes tragic. It is not heroic resistance. It is ritualized surrender. It marks the moment when knowledge becomes unbearable, when silence becomes safety, and when symbol becomes the only remaining structure in a disintegrating world. As we transition to 2.4, Forbidden Knowledge and Epistemic Collapse, we will explore how this function of the sign, as both boundary and symptom, leads directly into the broader mythos theme of knowledge as corrosive. If 2.3 has traced the psychological limits of the sign's human use, 2.4 will trace its final implication, that to learn the truth is not to be enlightened, but to become unmoored. The sign, after all, is drawn not to remember, but to forget just enough to survive. The elder sign's narrative gravity does not derive from its geometry or its supposed protective power, but from the epistemological conditions in which it is invoked. To understand the sign is, by necessity, to confront the deeper theme that animates Lovecraftian horror, the peril of knowing too much. In a universe where knowledge is not liberating, but destabilizing, where the uncovering of truth corrodes the very mind that discovers it, the elder sign emerges as a desperate countermeasure. It is not a tool of revelation. It is a break against epistemic freefall, a symbolic gesture meant to slow the collapse of coherent thought. In Lovecraft's corpus, the pursuit of forbidden knowledge is almost always catastrophic. Characters who uncover hidden manuscripts, forbidden cults, or alien chronologies inevitably lose their grip on what might be called consensus reality. In The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, Francis Wayland Thurston pieces together disparate reports and cult testimonies, only to glimpse a truth so vast and interconnected that it leaves him intellectually paralyzed. In The Dunwich Horror, 1928, the decoding of ancient rituals reveals not salvation, but a cross-dimensional hybrid horror. The elder sign, when it appears in these contexts, functions not as the endpoint of discovery, but as the boundary marker of survival. It signals that the mind has reached its limit and must not proceed. We must pause to acknowledge the philosophical depth of this construction. In traditional Enlightenment paradigms, be they Platonic, Cartesian, or scientific, knowledge is equated with progress, freedom, and truth. But in Lovecraft's mythos, knowledge is not the light that dispels darkness. It is the darkness itself, unveiled. The elder sign, then, becomes the symbol of a radical epistemological break. It is not an invitation to inquire further. It is a glyph of interruption, the visual articulation of a necessary halt. In this sense, it functions analogously to a taboo, a prohibition whose purpose is not moral, but cognitive. Consider the role of texts within the mythos, the Necronomicon, Unosprechlichen Kulten, and Kulte de Ghoul. These tomes are not read for wisdom, but endured like radiation. Exposure leads not to enlightenment, but to breakdown, of language, logic, and identity. The elder sign often appears in or around these texts as if to warn, this knowledge is not yours to possess. In the Dunwich Horror, for example, Dr. Armitage and his colleagues consult the Necronomicon while preparing a rite involving the elder sign. The proximity of the sign to forbidden texts suggests that it is not an artifact of knowledge, but a barrier to its consequences, not X, but Y. The elder sign is not a gateway to truth, but a limit to understanding. It marks the place where further inquiry leads not to clarity, but to the unmaking of the self as a knower. In this way, it parallels ideas found in postmodern philosophy, particularly in the works of Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, where knowledge is not pure access to reality, but is always framed, contingent, and potentially corrosive. The elder sign, in this light, is a meta-symbol, a symbol about the act of symbolizing. It represents the limit beyond which language and signification begin to fail. This theme of epistemic collapse extends into the phenomenological. Lovecraft frequently describes his protagonists as suffering from dream memory confusion, hallucinations, or fragmented narration. The ability to tell the story breaks down as the knowledge intensifies. In the Shadow. Out of Time, 1936, Nathaniel Wingate Peaslee experiences an identity dislocation so profound that his own memories are overwritten by those of a non-human entity. The elder sign is conspicuously absent in this narrative, which suggests something instructive. Its presence in a story often corresponds to the last moment a human narrator can still function. Once the sign is gone, or forgotten, the descent into cognitive disintegration accelerates. This reveals something profound. The elder sign is not merely a tool, it is a symptom. It does not exist outside the collapse, it marks that collapse. Its invocation may delay the onset, but only briefly. Ultimately, it is a symbol of our desire to remain whole in the face of knowledge that would fragment us. It is the symbol we draw when we realize that understanding is no longer an act of mastery, but a surrender to forces too vast, too alien, too indifferent. Scholars of religion and mysticism might compare the elder sign to apophatic theology, the idea that the divine can only be spoken of in terms of what it is not. The elder sign participates in a similar structure. It is not a revelation, not a name, not an image. It is the space carved out around the unutterable. This puts it in line with ancient taboos and esoteric symbols, such as the tetragrammaton in Jewish mysticism, or the silence that surrounds the Eleusinian mysteries. These are not absences, they are structured silences designed to protect both the uninitiated and the initiated from the destabilizing force of raw contact. We must recognize that in cosmic horror, especially of Lovecraft's variety, the universe is not actively hostile. It is hostile to the assumption that humans can know it. The elder sign is our response to that indifference. It says, here, knowledge stops. Here, language fails. Here, sanity bends. It is not the end of a sentence. It is a sigil drawn over the mouth of inquiry itself. As we move into Part 3 and examine the literary manifestations of the elder sign, we must carry forward this understanding that the symbol does not function on a plot level alone. It is not a talisman, not an icon, not an object. It is a boundary, a warning, a residue. It marks the place where knowing becomes unknowing, and where readers, like characters, must decide how close they are willing to get to the edge. The elder sign's literary life begins not with a definitive appearance, but with a conspicuous absence of clarity. In this way, it is uniquely Lovecraftian. It first surfaces in H.P. Lovecraft's 1926 short story, The Shadow over Innsmouth. Though it remains unnamed there, alluded to obliquely through a tangle of whispered references, carved relics, and occult gestures. It is not until The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath and, more explicitly, The Dunwich Horror that the sign takes textual form, though even then, not a visual one. This lack of immediate depiction is not a failure of world-building, but a deliberate act of narrative restraint. In Lovecraft's mythos, the most potent symbols are not seen but suggested, never shown but always felt. The elder sign enters literature not as a fixed icon, but as an unresolved potential, a placeholder for something just outside the frame of cognition. This conceptual ambiguity is reinforced by Lovecraft's own correspondence. In a 1930 letter to Clark Ashton Smith, he notes, "I've never drawn the elder sign. Best that the imagination supply the missing thing, I think." This refusal to define is central to Lovecraft's symbolic economy. The sign does not gain power through clarity. It gains power by remaining half-glimpsed, like the entities it wards against. This narrative strategy connects the elder sign to a broader mythopoetic technique employed by Lovecraft, what critic S.T. Joshi has termed negative space world building, the deliberate use of ellipses, redactions, and gaps to evoke cosmic dread. The elder sign, in this regard, is less a glyph and more a textual aperture, a silence around which meaning orbits. The earliest literary connections between the elder sign and other mythos elements are subtle but deliberate. In The Dunwich Horror, the character of Dr. Armitage references ancient symbols used to contain the spawn of Yog-Sothoth. Though the elder sign is not explicitly named in this story, later correspondence and collaborative expansions retroactively associate this act of containment with the sign itself. A similar pattern unfolds in The Whisperer in Darkness, where academic protagonists encounter alien geometries and protective glyphs amidst fungal spores and mutilated brains. Again, no visual description is given, but the presence of an ancient symbol capable of checking intrusion is unmistakable. This intertextual drift, where one story echoes, refracts, and reframes another, is part of the mythos' self-replicating power. The elder sign becomes not a single fixed entity, but a networked semiotic trace, not X, but Y. The elder sign is not an individual symbol, but a literary process. It is not drawn once and for all. It is invoked again and again, differently each time. This fluidity allows it to connect across stories without collapsing into simple repetition. In The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, written 1927, published posthumously, Lovecraft introduces a pentagram-like figure used in necromantic rituals. Though not named the elder sign, it performs a similar function, bounding, containing, resisting. The symbol's meaning migrates across stories, like an unstable particle, its trajectory shaped by gravitational pulls of context, character, and cosmic threat. We must pause here to observe that this ambiguity is structurally significant. By refusing to anchor the elder sign in a single depiction, Lovecraft invites the reader to participate in its construction. It is a collaborative symbol, one that exists as much in the margins of the text as on the page itself. The absence of a canonical image mirrors the thematic core of the mythos. The idea that the universe is not only unknown, but unknowable. The Elder Sign's refusal to settle into a definitive form is an enactment of this very principle. A particularly telling moment occurs in the dream quest of Unknown Kadath, written in 1926-27, where Randolph Carter encounters various ancient races and protective signs while navigating the Dreamlands. Though no Elder Sign is named, the presence of a sigil capable of warding against cosmic forces is implied. Scholars have long debated whether these proto-signs are ancestral forms of the Elder Sign or merely thematic analogs. What matters ultimately is their function, to hold at bay the madness that leaks from the edges of dream and time. The recurrence of these protective symbols across multiple texts suggests a symbolic archetype, a recurring cultural response to cosmic scale. This reveals something profound. The Elder Sign is not an invention, but a literary recursion, a feedback loop of implication, function, and fear. It binds together disparate mythos, narratives not through consistency of design, but through consistency of purpose. Across stories, the sign functions as the narrative event horizon. It is what one draws before the boundary dissolves, what one whispers before the mind collapses, what one inscribes before stepping beyond the circle of reason. It is not a solution, it is a warning. Intertextually, the Elder Sign also connects Lovecraft's work to broader traditions in speculative and occult literature. It shares narrative DNA with the protective runes of Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan, 1890. The boundary symbols in Algernon Blackwood's The Willows, 1907, and even the conceptual weaponry of M.R. James. These authors, like Lovecraft, use symbols not to reveal truths, but to suggest limits, to show where language must end and silence must begin. In this way, the Elder Sign becomes a node in a much older tradition, the mark that says, stop. As we move next into subsection 3.2, we will examine the Elder Sign's role in a single major story, the Haunter of the Dark. There, for the first time, the sign is not just implied, but thematically embedded as a protective and narrative mechanism. The story will allow us to see how the sign functions within a closed narrative system, and how it fails. For the failure of the Elder Sign, we must note, is not its flaw. It is its purpose. The story ends, as many do, not with salvation, but with a deeper question. Was the symbol ever meant to work? Or was it simply the last word before the silence? If the Elder Sign enters the mythos in whispers and peripheral mentions, it is in The Haunter of the Dark, 1935, that it achieves its most iconic and narratively integrated form. Here, Lovecraft constructs not merely a setting haunted by cosmic presence, but a scenario in which the Elder Sign is a literal line between existence and annihilation. The story, often cited as Lovecraft's final major work of fiction, serves as both culmination and complication of the symbol's literary function. Within its brief but dense narrative lies the clearest articulation of what the Elder Sign does, what it means, and, most disturbingly, how easily it fails. The story follows Robert Blake, a poet and painter drawn to an abandoned church in Federal Hill, Providence, Rhode Island. The church, once home to the esoteric Starry Wisdom sect, contains in its upper steeple a mysterious artifact known only as the Shining Trapezohedron, a window to cosmic darkness and a beacon for the entity known as the Haunter of the Dark. Early in the story, Lovecraft carefully lays out the church's defensive mechanism, a trapezoidal stone room, sealed and insulated by ancient rituals, with a window covered in leaded panes and a physical Elder Sign carved into a metal seal upon the door. The symbol is not described in detail, but its presence is made textually explicit. The metal door bore certain characters whose description, repeated from mouth to mouth, Blake knew too well from the pages of forbidden lore. We must pause here. This marks the first and only time in Lovecraft's fiction where the Elder Sign is confirmed as a literal, physical ward, placed with intention to prevent the emergence of a specific cosmic entity. Its effect is clear and measurable. As long as the Elder Sign remains intact and the lights remain on, the Haunter cannot escape. This clarity, however, is itself destabilizing. For a symbol that had until this point been defined by its vagueness, its sudden concretization feels almost uncanny. The boundary becomes visible, and in Lovecraft, What becomes visible always becomes vulnerable. Indeed, the entire narrative arc of the Haunter of the Dark hinges upon the symbol's defeat. Through Blake's meddling and the inevitable arrival of a storm that plunges the church into darkness, the creature is released. The Elder Sign, rendered inert by the absence of light and the disruption of its surrounding architecture, can no longer contain the being. Blake's demise is swift, his final journal entries suggesting a descent into psychic terror as the Haunter approaches. It is about to burst through in another minute. The light, the light, the light. That final cry is not one of revelation, but of regression, the mind attempting to reassert the conditions under which the Elder Sign worked. Light, symbol, structure. These are the last desperate anchors of cognition, not X, but Y. The Elder Sign in this tale is not an assurance of safety, but a temporary dam against cosmic flood. It does not save Blake. It delays his unmaking. The narrative function of the sign, then, is not to grant power, but to illustrate its limits. This is essential. The sign is not a heroic glyph, but a diagnostic. It tells us when something is being held back and when it no longer can be. We must recognize the structural brilliance of this device. The Elder Sign here serves as a fulcrum between exposition and catastrophe. Its discovery signals not Blake's ascension into deeper understanding, but his irreversible proximity to doom. Unlike other mythos tales where symbols merely suggest danger, this story makes the sign an active participant in the plot's unraveling. It is a character of its own, one whose failure marks the turning point of the narrative. Once the sign loses its potency, the story itself collapses into dread, culminating in that final journal fragment, a masterstroke of ambiguity, where Blake's voice blurs into cosmic silence. Thematically, the Elder Sign here aligns with Lovecraft's enduring preoccupation with entropy, knowledge, and the boundaries of perception. The shining trapezohedron represents a kind of epistemic black hole, an object that does not offer knowledge, but extracts awareness from the observer. The sign, in contrast, is a membrane of refusal. It holds the unknown at bay, not by explaining it, but by preventing its articulation. Once it fails, the universe becomes legible, but fatally so. The creature that emerges is not a monster in the traditional sense. It is an ontological intrusion, an idea with claws. We see, then, that the Haunter of the Dark uses the Elder Sign to dramatize a cosmic equation. Protection or distance from truth. The closer one comes to understanding, the weaker the symbol becomes. Blake's journey is one of diminishing insulation. Each step toward the church, up the tower, into the room, is a step beyond the sign's radius. And in this proximity, madness ceases to be a metaphor. It becomes the medium of narrative. This reveals something profound. The Elder Sign is most powerful when unseen. The moment it is recognized, contextualized, and named, it begins to lose its force. Like language itself, it can only contain what remains outside of it. Once the Haunter is glimpsed, once the trapezohedron reflects that non-light, the symbol becomes irrelevant. In this, the sign serves as a commentary on literature itself. The attempt to name the unnameable, to write the ineffable, is the very act that summons it. As we proceed to 3.3 and examine a second major story, the Dunwich Horror, we will see how the sign operates in a radically different narrative frame. There, it is not used in isolation, but as part of a ritual collaboration, a group act of containment against something already birthed. If the Haunter of the Dark explores the failure of the individual before the cosmos, the Dunwich Horror suggests the possibility, however fleeting, of communal resistance. Yet, even there, the sign is no triumph. It is a mark of last resort. If the Haunter of the Dark stages the Elder Sign as a symbol of personal futility against incomprehensible cosmic force, then the Dunwich Horror, 1928, reframes it, at least superficially, as a rare instrument of containment and collective resistance. This story offers one of the few instances in Lovecraft's corpus where human effort appears to succeed in repelling the alien, the unholy, the unspeakable. Yet even here, victory is not absolute, not clean, and certainly not redemptive. The Elder Sign in the Dunwich Horror is not a triumph of arcane science, but a ritualized admission of humanity's limitations, a last resort deployed by those who recognize the sheer scale of what they do not control. The story centers around the Whately family of rural Massachusetts, whose interbreeding with the outer god, Yog-Sothoth, produces two children, one visible and grotesque, the other invisible and unspeakable. The latter, a monstrous intangible presence referred to only as It, roams the countryside, flattening forests, disturbing livestock, and driving entire families to madness. As the plot unfolds, it becomes clear that conventional knowledge is powerless against this entity. Enter Dr. Armitage of Miskatonic University, alongside Professors Rice and Morgan, who descend upon Dunwich bearing rare tomes, esoteric knowledge, and the Elder Sign. Crucially, the sign is not wielded here as a standalone symbol, but as a component in a broader ritual. Lovecraft describes a climactic scene atop the ridge near the Whately farmhouse, where Armitage and his colleagues draw sigils, chant incantations, and inscribe the Elder Sign as part of a multi-layered magical framework. Though the glyph itself is never visually described, true to Lovecraft's aesthetic of omission, its function is unmistakable. It is the boundary, the crucible in which the impossible is held. Armitage himself states that the sign is necessary to fix the angles and prevent the hybrid beyond reckoning from entering our plane more fully. The implication is profound. The Elder Sign does not destroy. It contains, not X, but Y. The Elder Sign is not a weapon, but a ritual vector. It works not through force, but through alignment of minds, bodies, and dimensions. Its power lies in its participation in a symbolic geometry that momentarily resonates with the deeper structure of the cosmos. This usage parallels ancient traditions in ceremonial magic, where pentagrams, circles, and sigils are not inherently magical, but must be activated through ritual correspondence. The Elder Sign in the Dunwich Horror does not repel Yog-Sothoth's spawn because it is sacred. It does so because it is in tune with a temporary logic of containment. We must recognize that this containment is only possible because of collective action. Unlike Robert Blake in The Haunter of the Dark, who acts alone and falls victim to his own curiosity, Armitage operates within a triad, a scholarly cabal whose combined knowledge just barely keeps the horror in check. The Elder Sign here becomes a collaborative utterance, a shared symbol whose efficacy depends on mutual belief and coordinated execution. The story even suggests that the sign's power wanes when not continuously reinforced, requiring persistent chanting, reinscription, and the layering of additional symbols. In this sense, the sign is not a fixed seal. It is a living ritual, one that must be sustained. Consider carefully the dialogue between Armitage and the invisible entity during the final confrontation. Though the creature cannot be seen, it responds in pain and confusion as the ritual builds. "Father, Father, not on the hill, not on the hill." The horror of this moment lies not in its spectacle, but in its revelation that the creature, though cosmic in origin, retains some semblance of consciousness, of familial connection, of identity. The Elder Sign, then, is not acting upon a brute force, but upon a being capable of pleading. This ethical ambiguity deepens the sign's significance. It is not sealing off a monster. It is denying a child its parent, and doing so for the sake of a world unprepared to understand that union. This reveals something profound. The Elder Sign's function here is not just protective, it is denial incarnate. It says no to a reality already in motion. It undoes a birth, intercepts a process, refuses a merging of planes. In doing so, it asserts a human-centric boundary, not because humanity is central to the cosmos, but because it is central to the human mind. The sign is a manifestation of our unwillingness to dissolve. And like all such manifestations, it is temporary. Intertextually, the Dunwich Horror connects the Elder Sign to other containment strategies across the mythos. The rituals performed here echo those in The Shadow, Out of Time, and the case of Charles Dexter Ward, where characters attempt to seal knowledge behind barriers, physical, mental, historical. Yet, the Dunwich Horror alone makes the containment visible, audible, legible. The Elder Sign is no longer a whispered hint, but an operational component. And yet, this clarity comes at a cost. The more the sign is defined, the more we are forced to confront its fragility. As we transition into subsection 3.4 and explore the collaborative and derivative expansions of the sign, particularly in the hands of August Derleth. We will see how this moment of functional clarity gave rise to a mythopoetic codification. The elder sign became fixed, its form standardized, its usage gamified. But the seeds of that transition are already planted here. In The Dunwich Horror, Lovecraft shows us what it takes for the elder sign to work. What follows in later decades is the question of whether such functionality should ever have been imagined as stable to begin with. The elder sign's evolution did not end with Lovecraft's death in 1937. In fact, its most widely recognized form, an upright pentagram with a flaming eye at the center, owes far more to August Derleth's interpretive interventions than to Lovecraft's original vision. Through a blend of literary homage, creative reinterpretation, and mythographic systematization, Derleth and his contemporaries transformed the elder sign from an intentionally ambiguous concept into a codified symbol with specific magical properties, theological alignments, and visual consistency. This shift, while enormously influential, raises critical questions about authorial intent, mythos fidelity, and the dangers of reducing suggestive horror to a structured taxonomy. Derleth, who styled himself as the executor of Lovecraft's literary estate, undertook the task of expanding and organizing the Cthulhu mythos under a moralized quasi-Christian framework. His letters and stories throughout the 1940s and 1950s attempt to impose a dichotomy between elder, gods, benevolent, and great old ones, malevolent. A binary that Lovecraft himself never endorsed. In Derleth's cosmology, the elder sign becomes a tool of cosmic righteousness, a glyph that repels evil, safeguards the soul, and channels the power of ancient allies. No longer a barrier to unknowability, it becomes a sigil of divine opposition, aligning the mythos with traditions of esoteric Christianity, Hermeticism, and Kabbalistic mysticism. We must pause here and consider the implications of this reframing. Lovecraft's horror rested on the absence of cosmic order, the unbearable realization that no moral framework, divine hierarchy, or ritual magic could protect humanity from the indifference of the universe. Derleth's elder sign subverts that foundation. It is not a symbol of ambiguity, but of clarity. It does not suggest the limits of knowledge, but promises metaphysical defense. In doing so, it replaces philosophical horror with heroic fantasy. This is not Lovecraftian. It is derivative reorientation, a transformation that turns unknowing into structured mysticism. Not emptiness, but agency. Not collapse, but containment. Not suggestion, but system. This transition becomes especially pronounced in published visualizations of the elder sign. While Lovecraft avoided ever describing or drawing the sign in his fiction, perhaps to maintain its power of ambiguity, Derleth and his collaborators were less reticent. A five-pointed star enclosed in a circle, or occasionally a branching tree-like rune resembling the Norse Algiz symbol, began to appear in Arkham House publications and fan art as early as the 1940s. By the 1970s, the image had become ubiquitous in gaming supplements, especially in Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu role-playing system. There, the sign functions as a spell component, a protective ward, and even an object of inventory, divorced from its literary roots and repurposed as a game mechanic. This reveals something profound. The elder sign has become what it was originally meant to resist, a legible technology for navigating the unknowable. In these later expansions, it acts not as a threshold of epistemic collapse, but as an interface between the human and the inhuman. Its original function as a boundary of unknowing is overwritten by its new role as a cosmic key, one that presupposes access, control, and even victory. The ambiguity of the sign has been domesticated. It has become a symbol you can draw, a rule you can follow, a certainty you can invoke. Yet even within these derivative systems, tension remains. Writers such as Ramsey Campbell, Brian Lumley, and Caitlin R. Kiernan have tried to revive the sign's obscurity, re-injecting ambiguity into its appearance and meaning. Campbell, in particular, reimagines the sign in his Severn Valley mythos stories as a deliberately flawed defense, a glyph that may or may not work, depending on unknown variables. This version resists Derleth's moral binary and gestures back toward Lovecraft's original aesthetic. Horror not as definable opposition, but as unresolvable implication. Scholars, too, have debated the ramifications of the sign's evolution. Literary critics like S.T. Joshi and Robert M. Price argue that Derleth's contributions, while earnest, distort the essential nihilism of the mythos. They view the structured elder sign as a betrayal, an anchor that tries to steady a worldview built on drift. Conversely, fans and game designers often defend the sign's utility, arguing that a mythos needs internal coherence to function across multiple mediums. The elder sign, in their view, is a tool for narrative survival, a symbol that permits play, experimentation, and recursive storytelling. We must recognize the larger pattern at work here. The elder sign has become a cultural artifact in its own right, existing beyond any single author or text. It embodies the paradox of myth-making. That which gains power through repetition also risks losing its mystery. The more we see the sign, the more we understand it. The more we understand it, the less it horrifies. Its trajectory mirrors that of other once esoteric symbols, like the pentagram, the Eye of Horus, or the Ouroboros, which began as mystic emblems and ended as icons of fashion, branding, or aesthetic detachment. As we move into Part 4 and examine the cultural and psychological afterlife of the elder sign, we must keep in view its strange journey. It began as a whisper, became a ward, then a weapon, then a logo. It is no longer merely a glyph in Lovecraft's fiction. It is a shared symbol across games, subcultures, art, and imagination. A meaning machine that generates new content even as it loses connection to its original context. But this too is cosmic. The elder sign, like the forces it was meant to resist, has grown beyond comprehension. It has escaped its authors, and it waits, inscribed in margins, etched on dice, glowing in arcane apps, for the next reader, the next interpreter, the next blessed misreading. Though the elder sign originated within the controlled literary architecture of Lovecraft's fiction, it has since escaped into the cultural wild, leaking through the boundaries of literature into conspiracy theory, hoaxcraft, and urban legend. This migration from text to truth is not accidental. Rather, it reflects a core dynamic of the sign itself, the tension between the imagined and the real, between that which is deliberately authored and that which appears unbidden in the margins of our world. What began as an ambiguous glyph in a fictional mythology has, over the decades, been cited in forums, scrawled on alley walls, posted in cryptic online images, and, most notably, claimed as found evidence in contemporary accounts of paranormal disturbance. In short, the elder sign has become not just an artifact of fiction, but a participant in the machinery of belief. Reports of the elder sign in the wild trace back to the late 1970s, when a spate of small press occult zines in California and the UK began publishing supposed eyewitness sketches of glyphs matching the Derleth-derived pentagram with the flaming eye. These symbols were said to have been discovered carved into trees near alleged thin places, locations where the boundary between worlds is weakened. One such report appeared in a 1981 issue of the Esoteric Review, documenting an abandoned bunker on Dartmoor, where strange chanting had been heard and a sign of five-fold geometry seared into concrete. No verification ever followed, and yet the story was widely shared, partly due to its eerie plausibility, and partly due to the deliberate overlap with Lovecraftian imagery. The hoax became legend, and the legend became citation. We must pause here and note that this is not unique to the elder sign. Throughout history, fictional artifacts have become real in the minds of those willing to believe. Consider the Voynich manuscript, the Necronomicon itself, popularized into false grimoires, or the Codex Seraphinianus, all invented or undecipherable, yet all treated with reverence in esoteric communities. The elder sign joins this tradition as a kind of semiotic parasite, a symbol that replicates not through validation, but through desire. People want it to be real. They seek it in subway graffiti, in crop circles, in the margin of ancient texts digitized and uploaded to obscure corners of the internet. Its mystery invites projection, not authenticity, but plausibility, not fact, but ritualized uncertainty. The rise of the internet, particularly anonymous message boards and early forums like alt.horror.thulu in the 1990s, accelerated the mythologization of the sign. Dozens of hoaxes emerged, many centered on sightings of the symbol, in global locations associated with mystery, abandoned mines in Siberia, ancient catacombs in Malta, and even inside decaying NASA documents allegedly leaked during the post-Apollo era. These accounts often followed a familiar narrative arc. The witness finds the sign, experiences auditory hallucinations or insomnia, begins drawing it obsessively, and then disappears, either from the forum or, in more elaborate versions, from reality itself. The ritual of the hoax mirrored the narrative architecture of Lovecraft's stories, reinforcing the idea that encountering the sign was not just dangerous, but ontologically destabilizing. Consider carefully the way such hoaxes operate. They do not attempt to prove, they attempt to evoke. Their goal is not persuasion, but infection. Like the sign itself, they work best when half-believed, when suspended between satire and sincerity. This ambiguity fuels their persistence. Even mainstream urban legend compilations, such as Jan Harold Brunvan's collections or The Fortean Times, have occasionally referenced elder sign appearances without fully committing to their reality. In this gray zone, the sign thrives. In more recent years, the spread of augmented reality, AR, and AI-generated images has introduced new layers of complexity. Viral TikToks and YouTube Shorts now feature elder sign sightings, enhanced by digital effects, symbols glowing on cave walls, pulsing in street murals, or appearing on the skin of unwitting participants. These modern iterations continue the tradition of the hoax, but with a postmodern twist. The creators acknowledge the artifice even as they frame it as part of the myth. "I added the sign," says one caption, "but it was already there." Here we see the full loop of mythopoesis, a fictional symbol reinserted into reality, recorded, distorted, and reabsorbed as a new fiction that feels like truth. This reveals something profound. The elder sign's power no longer lies in its origin, but in its mimetic flexibility. Unlike traditional symbols tied to doctrine or heritage, the elder sign gains strength by refusing fixed definition. It means protection, or danger, or madness, or resistance, depending on who invokes it. Its semiotic instability becomes a feature, not a flaw. It allows the symbol to adapt, to mutate, to survive in the digital swamps of modern folklore. And yet, we must ask, what does this hunger for the sign say about us? Why do individuals continue to invent sightings, to fabricate testimonies, to embed the glyph in stories that blend hoax and haunting? Perhaps it is not the sign we believe in, but the feeling of belief itself, the thrill of standing before a symbol that seems to mean more than it reveals. In an age defined by irony, conspiracy, and algorithmic manipulation, the elder sign endures because it promises a glimpse of the real within the unreal, the sacred within the constructed. As we transition into subsection 4.2, we turn from the world of hoax and myth to the deliberate appropriations of the elder sign in media, films, games, and music that have reinterpreted, commodified, and reinscribed the glyph for mass consumption. But we carry with us a crucial insight. Even when seen through the lens of entertainment, the elder sign never quite loses its edge. It is not simply a horror motif. It is a psychic echo, vibrating between fiction and folklore, story and signal. If the elder sign began its existence as a textual whisper, half glimpsed in stories and footnotes, it has, over the last several decades, become an icon, embedded across visual and interactive media. Unlike many other symbols from cosmic horror, which remain obscure or literary in tone, the elder sign has undergone a process of semiotic crystallization in modern culture. It is no longer merely referenced. It is depicted, deployed, and in some cases, actively used as a tool within fictional and ludic systems. Films, games, and music have each taken hold of the sign, repurposing it to serve varying aesthetic and narrative ends. What results is not a unified interpretation, but a palimpsest, layers of meaning, function, and form that obscure and reinforce each other in recursive cycles. In the realm of film, the elder sign appears most often not as a central motif, but as a background texture, a glyph scrawled on walls, etched onto talismans, or glimpsed in dream sequences. Its presence is felt most notably in works inspired by Lovecraftian aesthetics, even when they are not direct adaptations. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, includes several scenes where arcane symbols, including stylized pentagrams and intersecting geometries, frame moments of psychological unraveling. Though never named explicitly, viewers familiar with the mythos have long speculated these are distorted forms of the Elder Sign. More overt appearances occur in independent Lovecraft adaptations, such as The Call of Cthulhu, 2005 HPLHS, where the sign appears in Necronomicon illustrations, treated with religious reverence and textual authority. We must recognize that the sign's cinematic function is largely atmospheric. It is not explained but shown, not interpreted but invoked. It suggests protection or perhaps containment, but it is the ambiguity that does the work, not the symbol itself. As a visual cue, it performs the same labor as flickering lights or creaking doors in traditional horror. It signals thresholds of rupture, moments where the normal begins to fray. That this visual cue is now shared across multiple films, even outside of Lovecraftian circles, speaks to the sign's evolution from literary glyph to cinematic shorthand for the uncanny. In gaming, however, the Elder Sign takes on a more literalized and functional role, beginning with Call of Cthulhu, the role-playing game, Chaosium 1981. The sign became a standard component in the mechanics of mythos-based play. Here, it is treated as an item, sometimes a spell component, sometimes a passive warding effect, sometimes a collectible object necessary for plot progression. The 2011 Fantasy Flight card game, Elder Sign, makes this function explicit. Players must collect tokens shaped like the sign to seal away ancient evils and prevent the awakening of great old ones. Each token represents a successful invocation of the symbol's protective power, not fear, but strategy, not suggestion, but gamification. This shift from symbol to mechanic reflects a larger tension in mythos adaptations. How to maintain the horror of the unknowable while allowing players to engage with it directly. In these games, the Elder Sign becomes a currency of control. It turns back the chaos, restores order, and quantifies safety. And yet, this very quantification may undercut the symbol's original thematic resonance. What was once a mystery becomes a solution. What was once a ward of desperation becomes a winning condition. Still, not all games fall into this pattern. Indie titles like The Shore, 2021, and Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, incorporate the sign in more unsettling ways. In these games, the sign appears in ruins, hallucinations, or ritual spaces, never fully explained and rarely reliable. Players may think they are safe behind it, only to find the symbol burns, crumbles, or fades, as if the game itself rejects certainty. This liminal usage, between tool and trap, more closely aligns with Lovecraft's original aesthetic, wherein symbols do not resolve the horror but magnify its implications. In the musical realm, the Elder Sign's appearances are more abstract, but no less potent. Artists in the dark ambient and metal genres, especially those operating within the Lovecraftian occult subculture, frequently use the sign in album artwork, liner notes, and lyrical content. Bands like Nox Arcana, Necronomicon, and the Great Old Ones have all released albums where the sign is either referenced by name or depicted on covers, often stylized as a fusion of runic and chaos magic sigils. The 2013 album Al-Azif by the Great Old Ones includes a track titled The Elder Sign, composed as a dissonant churning piece meant to evoke ritual invocation gone awry. Here, the sign functions not as narrative device, but as atmospheric motif, a symbol through which musicians channel dread, scale, and the ineffable. The use of the sign in musical spaces exemplifies its flexibility. It can suggest spiritual resistance, occult communion, or nihilistic transcendence, depending on the tonal palette and audience orientation. In this, it mirrors ancient symbols like the Ankh or the Ouroboros, conceptual reservoirs whose meanings shift across contexts but never fully empty out. This reveals something profound. The Elder Sign persists across media because it speaks not to what we know, but to what we fear might be knowable. Its ambiguity is its power. The symbol never fully resolves into fixed meaning because the horror it indexes cannot be domesticated. Whether as game piece, cinematic glyph, or album cover, it remains fundamentally unstable, an invitation to question what lies beyond interpretation. And yet, we must ask, In translating the elder sign into so many forms, have we drained it of mystery? Or is its ubiquity a kind of defense mechanism, a way of confronting the unbearable by embedding it in culture, in games, in music? Perhaps both. The sign survives because it adapts, but in doing so, it risks becoming visible armor rather than hidden warning. In the next subsection, 4.3, we turn from the realm of popular media to that of academic and subcultural appropriation, where the elder sign is no longer merely invoked, but analyzed, theorized, and inscribed into systems of belief, philosophy, and countercultural identity. There, too, it refuses to rest. In recent decades, the elder sign has transcended its fictional origins and visual proliferation to become something more elusive, yet deeply resonant, a semiotic touchstone for subcultural identity and scholarly speculation. No longer merely a literary artifact or a horror trope, it now functions as an epistemic and aesthetic marker within a variety of communities, ranging from occult revivalists and postmodern theorists to transmedia artists and digital lore enthusiasts. The sign is not simply used, it is inhabited, theorized, and reconstituted as part of broader discourses about knowledge, power, and the limits of human perception. It has become, paradoxically, both a protective sigil and a philosophical provocation. In academic contexts, the elder sign has received increasing attention from literary critics, media theorists, and scholars of religion and semiotics. Scholars such as S.T. Joshi and Robert M. Price have long debated its textual implications, but more recent work, such as Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock's Essays on the Weird in American Literature, or Roger Luckhurst's analyses of Lovecraftian epistemology, situate the sign as a metaphor for symbolic instability itself. It is not merely a glyph, but a critique of glyphs, a self-aware emblem of the insufficiency of language in the face of cosmic reality. In this sense, the sign functions as what Jacques Derrida might call a difference, a deferral of meaning that resists closure even as it invites interpretation. This reveals something profound. In scholarly circles, the elder sign has become a discursive black hole, a symbol that generates papers, panels, and theoretical frameworks, but never yields a stable definition. Its power lies in its refusal to resolve. It is not a code to be broken, but a reminder that some codes resist decoding altogether. Academic conferences on speculative fiction or esotericism now routinely feature presentations on the cultural function of the sign, with competing theories proposing it as everything from a Jungian archetype of collective anxiety to a recursive sigil that indexes the very collapse of epistemic authority in the post-truth era. Not clarity, but recursion. Not knowledge, but infinite inquiry. In subcultural spaces, the elder sign has been equally absorbed and reconstituted. Occultist communities, especially those influenced by chaos magic, techno-paganism, and the post-industrial esoteric revival, have appropriated the sign into their symbolic vocabularies. Importantly, these uses are not always ironic. Many practitioners treat the sign as a functional sigil, used in rituals of protection, banishment, or dream work. Some claim that its form, whether in the pentagram with eye or the tree-like rune described in Lovecraft's letters, resonates with particular energetic properties, particularly in liminal rituals, or as a warding device during astral projection. Whether one believes in such claims is less significant than the fact that they exist. The sign has entered the symbolic economy of lived belief. Consider carefully the way online occult forums and Discord servers discuss the elder sign. One might expect satire, but often finds sincere experimentation. Users share variations of the sign's form, debate its energetic alignments, and post-digital sigil charges based on Lovecraftian coordinates. Some blend the sign with traditional grimoires, suggesting correlations with the Enochian alphabet, or overlay it with sigils from the Key of Solomon. In these spaces, the elder sign becomes not a Lovecraftian relic, but a living symbol, mutable, re-enchanted, and woven into personal ritual systems. Parallel to this, certain artistic and fashion subcultures, particularly within dark wave, vaporwave, and occult aesthetics niches, have appropriated the sign as a kind of anti-brand. Clothing lines, enamel pins, and limited-run zines feature the glyph in stylized variants, often paired with cryptic Latin, glitch art, or archival textures. Its appearance signals not only an interest in Lovecraftian horror, but a broader sensibility of aesthetic dissociation, the sense that reality itself is perforated, layered, and prone to symbolic interference. The sign thus marks identity, not allegiance, initiation, not certainty. We must recognize that this usage, however fragmented, mirrors the core function of the elder sign as originally conceived, not to protect, but to signify the presence of something untranslatable. In both scholarly and subcultural contexts, the sign is not decoded but performed. It serves as a marker of threshold states between the known and the unknowable, the serious and the satirical, the fictional and the real. Its repetition across spaces is not proof of meaning, but an index of ontological leakage, evidence that even invented symbols can take root and sprout in the fertile chaos of culture. What then are we to make of this widespread appropriation? Perhaps it tells us less about the sign itself, and more about the symbolic economy in which we now live. We inhabit a world saturated with signs, logos, and sigils, many of which have lost their original reference. In such a world, the elder sign thrives not because it is old, but because it is unfinished. It invites users to complete it, reinterpret it, misuse it. And in doing so, it replicates the very process of cosmic horror itself, an encounter with a signifier that refuses to be anchored, that destabilizes all attempts to stabilize it. In the final subsection, 4.4, we will explore the enduring psychological and philosophical implications of the elder sign, not just what it has come to mean, but why its unmeaning continues to resonate in an age defined by semantic excess and spiritual fatigue. The sign endures not despite its ambiguity, but because of it. The elder sign, having drifted from fiction to folklore, from hoax to gameplay, and from academia to subculture, leaves us not with clarity, but with a haunting residue, a symbol that resists conclusion even as it demands interpretation. It is the embodiment of a central paradox in the philosophy of horror, the desire to name that which cannot be known, to mark the boundary between comprehension and collapse. In tracing the trajectory of this symbol, we come to realize that its endurance is not due to consistency, but to its semantic indeterminacy. The elder sign survives because it never settles into what it is supposed to be. Psychologically, the sign operates as a ritualized response to existential uncertainty. In the modern world, where traditional symbols of order, religious, national, scientific, have increasingly failed to provide coherent meaning, there arises a hunger for alternative glyphs, for invented mythologies that paradoxically feel more authentic, precisely because they are self-aware fabrications. The elder sign, in its fragmentary and contradictory nature, fulfills this hunger. It does not explain, but disorients. It does not reassure, but affirms that the lack of reassurance may itself be the only universal condition. This reveals something profound. We do not merely fear the unknowable, we seek it out. Contemporary thinkers like Eugene Thacker, in works such as In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, argue that horror is one of the last philosophical genres that dares to confront the unthinkable. The elder sign becomes a totem of that confrontation. It is not protective in the talismanic sense, but in the cognitive sense. It protects the mind from the unbearable implications of a cosmos, without order, by suggesting, however faintly, that there might be some structure to the madness, even if that structure is alien, uncaring, or incompatible with human understanding. Consider carefully the recurring circularity of the sign across literature and media, a symbol meant to ward off the other that ultimately signals its presence, a glyph that purports to mark safety, but more often appears at thresholds of collapse. It becomes, in this way, a liminal artifact, not unlike ancient apotropaic markings found on medieval churches or the protective hex signs of Pennsylvania Dutch barns, symbols meant to ward off evil, but which often look suspiciously like invitations to it. The elder sign participates in this tradition, but removes the certainty of cultural anchoring. It is not a symbol of our gods, our demons, our cosmology. It is a placeholder for something that was never ours to understand. Philosophically, the persistence of the elder sign aligns with a broader cultural shift toward post-structuralism, nihilism, and ontological uncertainty. As Western metaphysics continues to dissolve under the weight of ecological crisis, technological acceleration, and epistemic fragmentation, the sign becomes more than a horror motif. It becomes a gesture toward the post-human. In a world where reality feels increasingly simulated, where identity is mutable and truth is platform-dependent, the elder sign does not ground us. It reflects our ungroundedness, not certainty, but survival in ambiguity, not knowledge, but lucid unknowing. It is here that we see the true philosophical function of the sign. It reminds us that belief does not require proof, that meaning can, emerge from repetition and invocation, even in the absence of foundation. Its power lies not in what it is, but in what it makes us do: gaze, draw, speculate, protect. In this way, the elder sign functions as a technique of mystery, a practiced craft of not knowing, a learned ritual of confronting the incomprehensible with symbol rather than solution. And perhaps that is its final gift. In a cultural landscape increasingly driven by optimization, transparency, and algorithmic closure, the elder sign remains stubbornly opaque. It invites us to remember that some forms of horror are not threats to be eliminated, but truths to be endured. That in Lovecraft's universe, and perhaps in our own, the most honest response to reality is not mastery, but awe. And awe, in its purest form, is indistinguishable from dread. We end not with resolution, but with recursion. The elder sign protects, unless it doesn't. It signifies knowledge, unless it obscures. It is ancient, unless it was invented last year. Its meaning lies not in what Lovecraft wrote, or what Derleth reimagined, or what gamers collect, or what scholars debate. Its meaning lies in its multiplicity, in its refusal to vanish, in the fact that you are still reading, still wondering, still uncertain. And that is the most Lovecraftian fate of all.